Thank you. Thank you very much. We're now moving to our panel, but I will, what I suggest, I will introduce the panelists just now, but then it will come one by one to speak because some of them have presentations. And of course, and I will link immediately to what Mr. Foxman just said, and he mentions the New York Times article that was published yesterday, entitled "Campus Debates on Israel Drive a Wedge Between Jews and Minorities." And it was noted there that now Israel-related divestment groups are at hundreds of major colleges across the US. The situation in other parts of the world are as bad in the UK, in the campuses in Canada, Australia, the Western world. It has become, people are hiding, academics are hiding their ties with Israel for fear that they might, that it might harm them. It has become politically correct to criticize Israel and not politically correct to support Israel. People are afraid to support Israel. We've met a group of people from the UK, non-Jews, but these very distinguished people saying that in the dinner parties in the UK, if you say something good about Israel, you are looked at with a crooked eye. And I think this is this worrying a phenomena that we see, and especially on campuses when people are afraid to say anything good about Israel, everything you hear is bad. And I agree, and we had here a few months ago, we had an evening on the academic boycott against Israel. There's a book, a very interesting book about it, and we had the editors here speaking exactly about this impact and influence that what's happening now on the campuses is going to have on the next generation of leaders, on the next generation of business people, on the next generation of those that are going to rule the world, and what they are learning and understanding now about Israel is going to formulate the way they see things in the future. We at the INSS have identified this phenomena as a potential threat to Israel's national security, maybe not an existential one, but a threat nevertheless, and naturally have begun researching aspects of it. Apart from myself, our team includes Einav Yogev, who's hiding over there in the back, and Michal Chatuel, who also helped organize this evening, both working together with me on this project. One of the important forces involved in the attempts to counter this dangerous campaign is Mr. Abe Foxman and the ADL under his leadership. It is telling that in the article that you mentioned in the New York Times, in seeking the perspective of the Jewish community on this issue, the reporter approached Mr. Foxman, who is quoted as stating that the divestment debate is concerning but not as existential. I don't know if I quoted you correctly. In the following panel, which we entitled Israel in a Global World, Defamation and Discourse, we tried to be not only negative, but have also the positive part of it, we will hear from three distinguished guests who I will shortly introduce about anti-Israel activities and discourse worldwide. In the limited time we have, we will touch on manifestations of the anti-Israel campaign on the ground and in the media, as well as on the boundaries of legitimate political discourse. Questions that immediately come to mind are the linkage between anti-Israel activities and anti-Semitism. When is criticism legitimate and when is it not? And what is the correlation, if any, between Israel's policies and the negative perception of Israel in international public opinion? In order to hear the answers, and without further delay, I will present our three distinguished panelists. As I said, don't come up yet. I will introduce the three of you, and then each one of you will come on up in his or her turn. You each have around 12 to 15 minutes. Our first panelist is Advocate George Deek. Advocate George Deek is a diplomat working at the International Law Department of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, which he joined in 2008. Until January this year, he served as the Deputy Chief of Mission and as Chargé d'Affaires at the Embassy of Israel in Norway. He is an Arab Christian Israeli from the city of Jaffa, where his family has lived for over 400 years. And finally, I'd like to note that the Allgemeiner, I hope I pronounced it correctly, the Allgemeiner magazine elected George in 2014 as one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life in the world. So that's George. You can clap. And we'll call you in a second back on. After George, Miri Eisen will come and talk to us. Miri Eisen is a retired colonel. She was born in San Francisco and came to Israel. She was in the IDF Intelligence Corps, and then she served as the Israeli Prime Minister's international media advisor and as the Israeli government's spokesperson. Today, she is one of Israel's main commentators, speaking on regional geopolitics and security-related issues in the media, worldwide, meeting groups all the time. She also teaches at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya and is a fellow at the Center for International Communication at Bar-Ilan University. That's Miri. Now, last speaker, but not least, will be Michel Kishka, one of Israel's best-known caricaturists. He was born in Belgium to a family of Shoah survivors. He studied at the Bezalel Academy of Arts in Jerusalem, where he is currently a senior lecturer on cartoons, comics, and illustration. We all know, I think, Michel from his illustrations for the printed press, both local and international, as well as for the different TV shows and children's books. He has illustrated more than 50, or around 50 such books. So he will be our third speaker. So now, without further delay, we will start with George Deek, who will tell us about manifestations of BDS abroad based on his experience in the ministry in general and in Norway in particular. George.
Good evening. What a privilege and an honor to be here today in this evening honoring you, Mr. Foxman. And it's a great privilege to be with everyone here today. I want to start by telling you something that happened last year. When I was in Norway in February 2014, I was the chargé d'affaires, the acting ambassador, and suddenly we get the news that the YMCA in Norway decided to boycott Israel economically. Now, we were very surprised because it's a Christian organization and Christians are automatically identified as closer to Israel than others. And it's a youth organization heavily involved in philanthropic activities, helping people throughout different places in the world. And they decided to boycott Israel. And it reminded me, I remember that when I first got to Norway, I was told two things, that Norway is a hostile country on the border of being an anti-Semitic country. And the second thing that I was told, the problem is the lack of information. Now, about the first claim, from my experience in Norway, Norway is not an anti-Semitic country. Norway is not hostile to Israel. In fact, the trade between Israel and Norway in 2014 was the highest trade ever in the history of the relations. We had the president of Israel, Peres, visiting Norway just last year. But it doesn't mean that there isn't hostility in the air. When 38% in 2012 said in a poll, 38% of the people said that Israel is treating the Palestinians the same way Nazis treated the Jews, then you realize that there is a problem in the education and in the discourse that takes place in the country. And it is based on this ground that the BDS is starting to work in Norway. Now, why 38% think that Israel is as bad as the Nazis? That we can leave for later. But first, about the BDS. What is BDS actually about? They're trying to do a boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel in three ways: culturally, academically, and economically. And they do it by using claims from the legal world, claims that Israel is doing things from genocide to apartheid, that Israel is a war criminal, that Israel is doing illegal things in contradiction to the international law, in contradiction to the human rights law. However, the real goals, as I've seen throughout my time in Norway, and before that in other places, and now in the ministry, is a little bit different. There is an organization that you might have heard about. It's called NURWAC. It's Norwegian Aid Committee. And it's headed by Dr. Mats Gilbert, that some of you have heard about. He's a Norwegian doctor that is very active in trying to promote medical assistance to people with special focus in Gaza. He was in Gaza during the last several operations. The funny thing is that Mats Gilbert was in Gaza and he indirectly supported Hamas. He never said, I support Hamas, but he was there and he was working with them and he was treating their people. Now, and his organization is getting funds from the Norwegian government. At the same time, last year, around October, I think, NURWAC was found having a hospital working in Iraq. And claims came to the newspaper that the newspaper is treating ISIS people. What was the reaction from the Norwegian government? Immediately an investigation was launched, and the result was that the hospital in Iraq stopped getting funding and therefore was closed by NURWAC because of the decision of the Norwegian government. Funnily, the same thing did not happen in Gaza. Funds continued going to NURWAC despite its indirect and sometimes direct support of Hamas. I also remember a case of a guy called Erik Hillestad, who is one of the biggest music producers in Norway. And he wrote an op-ed in July 2014 where he called for boycott in Israel using the same claims that we all know about. 2 days later, he was taking part in something called the Oslo Wall, which is an event in Oslo, in Litteraturhuset, which is the most intellectual place in the capital. And he took part in an event that its goal, and I quote, they described the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. It's called Oslo Wall because of the wall, the wall, Israel and the territories. The conflict is described as follows. It's a conflict between those who were robbed of their land, the Palestinians, and those who claim to be Jews. Not between Palestinians and Israelis or Palestinians and Jews, but between Palestinians and those who claim to be Jews. At the same time, they're completely delegitimizing the right of the Jewish people for the right of self-determination, which is the same right that they are calling for Palestinians. So I wrote back an op-ed to the newspaper in Norway, and I asked him, how can you say that you want the best for Israel, criticizing Israel, and you're saying that this is good because it will make Israel comply with international law, etc. At the same time, you're calling for the complete delegitimization of the idea of a Jewish state. So, unfortunately, I never got a response, and I'm still waiting almost a year afterwards. But basically, the main message they have is that Israel has no room in the Middle East. It's not about criticizing Israel, it's about demonizing and dehumanizing it. And in 48, 67, and 73, Israel's adversaries tried to put it through war in a military crisis. In the 70s, with the Arab boycott, they tried to put Israel in an economic crisis. With the notorious Durban resolution equating Zionism to racism, they tried to put Israel in a diplomatic crisis. And now they're trying to put Israel in a moral crisis. How do they do that? By abusing the human rights discourse, accusing Israel in almost every possible crime in today's human rights discourse. Crimes against humanity, wars crime, apartheid, genocide, and ethnic cleansing, and you can take it forward from here. But we have to ask ourselves, could they be right? Maybe their claims are right. Maybe Israel is committing things that are not okay, and maybe boycott is a legitimate tool. But the facts on the grounds are that every time, and I mean every time, the BDS movement went to court, they lost. Every time. We had the Veolia case, which is a French company that is building the train in Jerusalem, the light rail, and the BDS people took it to court saying that you're doing a project in East Jerusalem, it's occupied, it's illegal, you should stop. The French court twice rejected the file. Then we had Ahava, which sold its products in the UK. People came in, they tried to stop the sales of Ahava products, and then in court they were accused of trespassing, and they were convicted of trespassing, and the court not only found them guilty of it, but it also said that there's nothing illegal in selling goods from the West Bank. There's nothing illegal of economic activity in the West Bank, and it's perfectly okay to write Dead Sea, Israel when you talk about the land of origin. We had the issue of the French mayor of the city of Sislin, Jean-Claude something. Sorry? Yeah. No, not Van Damme, that's for sure. Yeah, I mean, Schwarzenegger became a governor, you never know. But he tried calling the boycott of Israel. He was taken to court, and he was found guilty in criminal charges for the boycott because of discrimination against the country of origin. And not only the French court found him guilty, but the European Court of Justice, in a decision taken 6-4 and 1 against, they agreed with the French court, saying that calling for boycott of Israel is illegal. So every time they go to court, they lose. But every time they go to the public, every time they go to the discourse, they get more and more sympathy, as we've just heard from Mr. Foxman about the sympathy they're getting to in campuses, etc. So how can we counter this phenomenon? Well, first, I would like to describe what happened in comparing it to something called the invisible gorilla experiment. Has anyone here heard of it? It's an experiment that took place in Harvard University in the 70s. They took a group of students, very bright students, Harvard after all, and they put them one by one in front of a TV screen. And they showed them a basketball game between one team wearing black, one team wearing white, and they told them, listen, your goal in this experiment is not to follow the score, not to follow anything else, but the exact number of passes of the ball between the white team. How many times do the white team players pass the ball from one player to another? Nothing else matters. At the end of the experiment, they counted the results, and apparently over 90% of the Harvard students knew how to count the exact number of passes between the white team members. But that was not the real experiment. The real experiment was, did you see anything unusual on your screen during those 10 minutes? And less than 40% saw something unusual. And the unusual thing was that in the middle of the game, a big guy dressed up like a gorilla walked in the middle of the court, looked at the camera, did this, and walked out. And less than 40% of the people saw that. I believe we are facing the exact same phenomena with the BDS discourse. The BDS activists are abusing the human rights discourse, leading people who would otherwise be good and decent people into questioning the right of Israel to exist. And they're doing it so much. They're telling people where to look and what to focus on and what is the important thing. It doesn't matter if there is terrorism. It doesn't matter if Israel is not recognized. The important thing is settlements. The important thing is Jerusalem. The important thing is right-wing in Israel. These are the core issues. And when you tell people to look at it long enough and strong enough, then the result will be they will not be able to see the gorilla on their screen. And I remember facing, first at the ministry, we have a great group of people at the civil society department who are trying to face and to counter those measures. And we're trying to monitor what is happening worldwide, and we're trying to give some guidance and some help to our embassies. And this is our greatest asset at the ministry, the fact that we have embassies every place who can count, because usually the tools used to counter BDS activity are local tools. For example, if you want to use legal tools, it has to be the legal tools of the specific country where you work. The laws in the United States are not the same as in Norway or in France or in Israel. And the biggest challenge that we are facing is making sure that the governments that we are working with, like the Norwegian government, who are our partners, and I have to say that the Norwegian government has been very cooperative in this, and the Norwegian government opposes BDS, it should be said, that academic boycott is exactly the opposite of what academy is all about. Instead of allowing more discourse and more opinions, you're trying to bully people to be afraid to express their opinions and using fear as a mechanism to bring more hostility towards opinions that are not exactly yours. In other words, freedom of speech is great as long as you agree with me. So I believe that our goal in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and our goal in general when facing BDS activities, to make it short, is to throw as many gorillas as possible at people's screens. We have to make sure that people stop seeing the relations between Norway and Israel as the relations between Norway. Instead of Norway and the state of Israel, it becomes Norway and the state of the conflict. Israel is a whole state, and it has great things happening, and it's our job to throw those gorillas that will break the narrative that these people are being told over and over again. People who are good and decent and fair, who want to do the good thing, who want to do the right thing, from falling victims into the hand of this discourse. Thank you very much.